to dozens of Democratic incumbents and to challengers at all levels of the electoral process. Celinda and her firm, Lake Research Partners, are known for cutting-edge research on issues including the economy, healthcare, the environment, and education, and they've worked for a number of institutions, the Democratic National Committee, the White House Project, AFL-CIO, Communication Workers Association, Sierra Club, Human Rights Campaign, you name it, they've worked for them. So today we're very excited to hear from Celinda Lake and to hear the latest on public opinion and messages that work. Celinda?
Thanks so much, and I'm delighted to be here with you all. And I apologize in advance. I have that cold that's going around, so I'll try not to cough in everyone's ear. But this is very, very exciting data. And what we wanted to do, and we also have included some data that's fresh off the press, just released this morning by Politico. So what we wanted to do was look at where we at in this budget debate, and particularly around the defense issue, what messages work, and what strategies we can pursue from here. And the origin of the research that Juan sponsored was very, very exciting work that they did along with a number of co-sponsoring organizations, was to really ask the tough question. We have enormous resistance in the public right now to cutting back on defense. For the first time in the last 3 years, the first time in history, we didn't even have it after 9/11. We didn't have it in the time of Ronald Reagan. Really since the 80s, women have been more supportive of defense cuts than men, except for the last 3 years. What's going on, and how do we overcome that resistance? So if we look first in our key findings, people are still very, very much focused on the economy and jobs as a top budget priority. And as we're going back and forth on the fiscal cliff and all of the different aspects of the fiscal cliff and the deficit, while the deficit has increased a little bit as the most important problem, it is important to remember that 50% more voters are worried about jobs and the economy as their #1 problem, and 3 times as many people are worried about jobs and the economy as the deficit as their second most important problem. So people are very, very focused on economy and jobs. And when it comes to defense or military or Pentagon spending, one of the things that actually voters have as a concern is, will it cost jobs if we cut back in this area? Voters in the budget debate strongly opposed to any efforts to cut Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid, and tax fairness, a very, very strong paradigm. People are very strongly in favor of increasing taxes on wealthy people who make over $250,000 a year or on large corporations. Now, the one place where there is vulnerability is people oppose increasing taxes on small businesses that make $250,000 a year or more. And so that is one of the places that you'll see the Republicans and the conservatives coming in more in trying to shift this debate from the wealthy and big corporations to small businesses. People are eager for a deal to be struck. They tend to think the fiscal cliff is, while the deficit is a problem, the fiscal cliff is largely politically made up. They're very open to a mix of budget cuts and tax increases. They definitely believe that taxing the wealthy should be on the table. And they are upset that progress is not being made and blame primarily the Republicans for that lack of progress. Voters solidly opposed to cutting the defense or military budget, however, more open to cutting the Pentagon budget. And women are more opposed than men, and I'll show you some new data on that was just released this morning. On slide 4, you see that the top issue is the economy and jobs. 61% of voters say this is the top issue. Only 11% pick the deficit. Only 5% pick the war in Afghanistan. Only 6% pick terrorism. People favor a variety of ways to create jobs. They believe that investment in education will improve our economy in the long run. They support investing in infrastructure roads, bridges, and schools, clean energy manufacturing, and you can see here 79 to 81% of the voters support that kind of investment. Voters are overwhelmingly, on slide 6, opposed to cutting Social Security benefits. 84% opposed to it, 78% opposed to cutting Medicaid, and 76% opposed to cutting Medicaid when you describe what it does. But one of the things that's very interesting here is that the Medicaid debate has really changed from when we had this debate before. And there was a time when people thought of Medicaid as welfare. They weren't exactly sure what it is. People are much, much more familiar with Medicaid now, much more likely to volunteer that it is nursing home care, health insurance, and people overwhelmingly oppose cuts in Medicaid, even when you don't define what it is. On slide 7, you can see that people overwhelmingly oppose ending traditional Medicare. People oppose replacing with a voucher. And people also oppose privatizing it, although that's a little more confusing to people because many people think of Medicare as a quasi-private system now because you get to go to your own doctor and you paid into the system. So we all know the seniors that have said in our focus groups, well, just tell the government to keep its hands off my Medicare. On slide 8, people overwhelmingly support raising taxes on incomes over $250,000 a year. 60% support that, 37% oppose it. And this is without calling them the wealthy or anything like that. If you call people the wealthy, etc., those numbers only increase. People also are in favor of a mix of tax increases and spending cuts. And people do believe that there are spending cuts that can be done. People also tend to have some belief that you could do across-the-board cuts and not hurt anyone. On slide 10, we asked people in general, how much can you reduce, should spending be cut to help reduce the deficit? 64% said defense spending should be cut. 50% said food stamps and housing vouchers. Notice Medicaid, even when you say for low-income families, Social Security, and Medicare, all opposed by people in terms of cutting to reduce the deficit. In polling that was released, in other polling that was done, you see here, do you favor support raising taxes on households with income over $250,000? Wildly in favor of it. Reducing Medicare benefits for those with high incomes. People would reduce that, although they do not think, by the way, that $60,000 is high income. They're thinking you mean like over $100,000 or $250,000. By the way, people also completely unaware of the cap on Social Security payments. And people believe overwhelmingly that that's a huge loophole, and people think, just like Medicare, you ought to have to pay Social Security benefits on your income all the way up. Reducing military spending, people divided on that. As you will see in a moment, much, much more popular to talk about Pentagon spending than military or defense spending. Again, solid opposition to reducing Medicare benefits, reducing Social Security benefits, or raising taxes on the middle class. On slide 12, you see the data that we just released today. And again, you see strong support for across-the-board cuts, but people always think that you can cut waste, fraud, and abuse and get the budget under control. Raising taxes on large corporations and on people over $250,000, very, very robust support, almost 2/3. People divided on ending foreign aid. People divided on reducing benefits for higher incomes for Medicare and Social Security. Note again, people do not think that $60,000 is higher income. They tend to think that we're talking about $100,000, $200,000. Notice making significant cuts in the budget of the Defense Department. 59% of the people oppose that. And again, it really depends on how you word this. People are very leery about making too deep a cuts in the military budget or the Defense Department or defense spending. And again, we're in a situation where women are more opposed than men. So only 34% of women support this, while 41% of men support making significant cuts. We have a solid majority of Republicans, 77%, and independents, 60%, who oppose making significant cuts in the budget of the Defense Department. And even Democrats are divided. Because of women being more nervous about this, it has made Democrats, who are more female, more nervous. And so 53% of Democrats support this, but 43% oppose it. Raising the retirement age for Social Security benefits, as well as Medicare benefits, people wildly opposed. And interestingly, on raising the age for retirement for Social Security, the younger you are, the more you oppose it, contrary to what people might think. It's actually the young people who are most opposed to this. And then raising taxes on small businesses that earn more than $250,000. This is a distinction that people make between individuals and large corporations. People are nervous about taxing small businesses, and of all the political actors in our system, small businesses are the most popular right now. So you want to be very, very careful about small businesses. When we ask people, many more people are aware of the fiscal cliff and the budget negotiations than used to be. It used to be only about 20% of people are aware. Far more people are aware of it now, and people do believe it's important. On slide 14, if an agreement is not reached, they blame by 2 to 1 the Republicans in Congress more than Barack Obama. If that's kind of the context in which we're operating, a context where people overwhelmingly support taxing the wealthy and big corporations, overwhelmingly oppose cuts to Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, are nervous about cuts to the defense budget, then how do we talk to voters, particularly about the defense piece of this in the current context? And I'm going to present to you for the rest of the meeting research that we did with Chris Matthews of Bellwether Research and Consulting, a Republican pollster. So this is Bipartisan Polling. Again, we were trying to understand the issue about why in the last 3 years have women been so much more resistant than men to cuts in defense or military budget. And that is true. That was even right after 9/11, when the security moms were in full force. We still had men more concerned about cutting military than women. In the last 3 years, it's been the reverse. First of all, it is much, much better to talk about the Pentagon budget. People are very, very worried, and women in particular are very worried about anything that would impact the troops or their families. And they worry when we talk about defense spending or military spending that that's what we're going to do. Secondly, women think this is a much more dangerous world than men do. And women are very nervous about cutting things that might contribute to our security and our defense. Voters are very open to making improvements. And it turns out it is very strong to talk about reshaping the military, stronger, by the way, than to refocus the military. And it's very strong to use the kind of language that Obama used in the debates about talking about that we need new kinds of weaponry, modern weaponry, not spend money on the kinds of weapons that we're spending money on right now. Voters aren't sure whether this reshaping of the military actually cuts what you're spending, but they certainly believe that we don't need to spend any more on the military, and they certainly wouldn't give the military any more than they asked for. We also looked in depth in the WAN survey at nuclear weapons, and many, many people are confused about nuclear weapons, and they tend to be split on nuclear weapons. People are nervous about nuclear weapons. They're nervous about who else is acquiring them, And it doesn't particularly help to say the facts here. People believe, and women in particular believe, that it is important to have the most nuclear weapons, the biggest, the best, the newest nuclear weapons. By the same token, it helps us a lot to talk about negotiated and verifiable reductions. That is very, very strong language for men and women. And that seems like moving forward in a way that will improve our security, not reduce our security. On slide 18, in both of these arenas, we also find that it's quite strong to look at the intersection of politics and the military. And I have to believe this would test even stronger since the elections than it was testing when we tested it originally. People believe overwhelmingly and agree overwhelmingly that what's driving our military expenditures is not safety, but lobbyists, politicians, pork barrel spending, political contributions. And among women, it's very, very strong to talk about the intersection of politics and the military, as well as among men. It also is very strong to talk about purchasing the new kinds of equipment that is needed, like drones, rather than the old kind of spending. They can be quite expensive, but it doesn't fit modern warfare. Validators are important here. And Colin Powell, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, very, very powerful. Retired generals, very powerful. And among women, Colin Powell is so powerful he even beats Hillary Clinton. As we said on slide 19, we want to cut the Pentagon budget, not the military budget. We want to talk about reshaping the military to be smarter and cutting waste, and not things that will impact bases, which are jobs, and troops and their families. We'll talk about changes that will make us safer and have it cost less, rather than we're going in to spend less money. People don't want to start with the frame of spending less money. They want to start with the frame of being safer. And negotiated and verifiable reductions in our nuclear arsenal, much, much stronger to people than talking about cutting warheads or talking about the weapons that other countries have. People really don't have the information to judge these facts. They don't know whether 1,500 is a lot or a little. They have no idea what others have. They don't care what others have. They want us to be the biggest and the most. And it's much, much more helpful to talk about verifiable and negotiated reductions rather than actual numbers or facts. The deficit frame is not the strongest frame if our long-term goal is to cut the military budget. We actually do just about as well without the deficit. And in fact, people are afraid that in the interest of the deficit, we will make cuts in the military that we shouldn't be making for reasons of safety. So while there is this opportunity for this conversation here, know that it is a very mixed opportunity. The far better conversation long term is to focus us under keeping America safe. And by the way, it does not help to talk about how much we spend versus other people. It does not help particularly to present charts of our spending versus other countries. People, in fact, interpreted those charts to look like it was dangerous, like China was catching up with us. It does not help to say we'll spend less in Iraq and Afghanistan. People believe that, but they think we may need the money elsewhere. It does not help to enter this through a spending frame or a tough budget frame or a deficit frame. It helps to talk about safety, politics, investing in the things that work now in a modern warfare, and that our troops and our security should come before pork barrel spending and politics. On slide 22, you can see here we spend too much, not enough, or about the right amount. People believe we spend too much on foreign assistance. People are mixed on how much we spend on the budget, the Pentagon, the defense, or the military budget, although notice the Pentagon budget tends to be the place they think we're spending the most. Notice all of the domestic priorities are things that people think that we're not spending enough on by huge margins. Having said that, though, people think, well, if you cut the military, you won't necessarily be able to spend that money in these other areas because of safety concerns. If you look at slide 23, you can also see whether we're spending too much, about the right amount, or too little. And notice, for men in particular, the Pentagon budget is a place we can cut. Men particularly perceive the Pentagon budget to be driven by waste. Women also the Pentagon budget. The least likely to be cut in people's minds is the military budget. And defense budget, not a very good language either. It's the Pentagon budget that we want to talk about. Again, a basic read here. Do you favor or oppose, on slide 24, cutting the military budget? Almost 2/3 of Americans oppose it. But notice when we ask the Pentagon budget, slide 25, we have a plurality in favor of cutting, and actually a majority of men. Also, when you talk about refocusing or reshaping the military to meet 21st century threats, overwhelmingly favored by people. On slides 26 and 27, you can see that reshaping testing even stronger, but real intensity and real support. Now, the dilemma is that people are not convinced that reshaping or refocusing won't require the same amount of money, but they certainly believe that it raises a question in their minds about whether we're spending our money the best way. As we move to nuclear weapons, you can see here that nuclear is still an area where women are more in favor and consider the technology more dangerous than men. So men oppose reducing nuclear weapons by 9 points. Women support it by 3 to 4 points, but it's not an overwhelming margin with either one. People are really divided on this question of whether we can reduce our nuclear weapons or not. When we talk about negotiated and verifiable reductions, you can see we start to pick up substantial support among men, women, and the overall sample. Notice we're still under 50%, though. People are still nervous about are we really going to be able to verify these, and is the other side going to cheat, or are we really going to be able to verify this nuclear reduction? When we ask people, do we spend too much, not enough, or about the right amount on nuclear technology, people were divided between more than enough and about the right amount. When we tell people how much we spend, this is an area where we start to pick up, and people start to think that we are spending more. It doesn't work for the overall military budget, but it does work for the nuclear budget to say that, to give people the facts about how much we are spending. On slide 31, we looked at the best openings to talk about cutting or reorganizing or reshaping our military spending. And you can see here that we had a number of very, very strong statements. The strongest was we can reorganize our military to be smarter in how we address today's threats and be more cost effective. People definitely thought we could get more for our money. They weren't sure if we could cut the amount of money, but we could get more for our money. The second strongest statement was we don't need to spend more. We just need to spend our money smarter or more cost effectively. And people overwhelmingly believed that we don't need to spend more. That's different than cutting what we have. Reshaping the military to be smarter and more cost effective, also very, very strong core orientation here. People like the idea of covert missions, new weapons, drones, etc. People did not conclude, though, by the way, that because we don't need to spend more, it means we can spend less. People are really kind of status-oriented in terms of the military, although they would not give the military more than they asked for, which is a new development that has happened that we haven't seen before. On slide 32, we see our strongest messages. Now, we think we have a strong message. Excuse me. When we have over 40% of the voters finding it very convincing, and over 60% finding it convincing. You can see here we have 3 messages that are testing excuse me, well over those levels. They all deal with some aspect of politics and pork barrel, and really elevating the fact that politics is driving this more than our safety. And we need to get the politics and pork barrel out of this spending. Very, very important. Notice we're also talking here not about spending this money solely on domestic priorities, but also spending this money on supports for our troops and their families, and supports for our safety here at home, and that's an important part of the argument. For men, the pork barrel spending is the strongest argument. For women, it helps to mention the drones, a very popular thing for women, the idea that we could, without manpower, keep track of the safety. And of course, many of us on this call think the drones are very controversial in the way they're being used. But it remains a very popular device because it doesn't involve manpower or women power to the public. But the key point here is that the frame of politics very, very strong to people. Validators also help. And you can see here on slide 33 the strength of messengers in the retired generals and Colin Powell. As popular as Hillary Clinton is and the president is, the military are the validators here. Retired generals, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Colin Powell, and Colin Powell really in a league of his own, significantly more credible, interestingly, to voters than John McCain. You can see on slide 34 the retired generals and Colin Powell in a league of their own with women, and even among women beating the very popular Hillary Clinton as a validator on this issue. So in this budget debate, we have both a clear roadmap, thanks to the folks at Juan and Will, on how to address the budget debate and how to address the defense budget or the Pentagon budget. It is not an easy roadmap. It isn't necessarily, many of us believe that if we could just get the facts out to people, that we could have a broader argument. But unfortunately, we know from work that we do that if the facts don't fit the frame, people don't reject the frame, they reject the facts. And except for the amount of money we're spending on nuclear, the facts really didn't make very much difference here. These are emotional issues to people, and it is the framing and the messaging that is so important. So let me stop there and open it up to the rest of the discussion, and then I'm eager to take your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Celinda. That was excellent. It was really, really great and informative. I just want to remind everyone to type in your questions for Celinda using the question panel, and I'll ask them aloud. But before we take your questions, I'm going to turn it over to Senator Nan Orrock. Senator Orrock? Senator Orrock, are you still with us?
I'm sorry, these mute buttons can really impede progress. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great, great. Thank you so much, Ozzy, for presiding over the call. I'm Nan Orrock, and privileged to head up the Women Legislators Lobby, the network of women across the country that are seated in state legislatures, as well as our former legislators, trailblazers, and we're proud to have 48 women in the new Congress that will be coming in that came to the Congress with our support and through our network. Celinda, what a marvelous presentation. We want to really appreciate you, and I think your words should echo and remain with us far beyond this call, and that is, you're not going to convince people solely on facts alone. We can come up with every flip chart and statistical study and white paper and purple paper and every sort of analysis that we want to come up with. But if it does not fit, if it's not reaching people through their frame of reference, they will reject the facts that are presented to them and stick with their frame. So that makes this messaging so critically important. So it's really vital every time we open our mouths, every time we put pen to paper or send out that email or prepare that message statement, from press releases to op-eds to letters to the editor to the conversation you have with your family at home over the holidays. The messaging is what counts in the frame of reference, and a flood of facts can sometimes be our worst enemy. Unfortunate news for policy wonks among us. But thank you. And Celinda has really battled through this, fighting one of these colds that are going around, and so we doubly appreciate her. And Uzi is gathering up questions now. We urge all of you to send in your questions, and we're just so happy that Juan, Women's Action for New Directions, and Will, Women Legislators Lobby, can provide these webinars. We've got a very robust attendance today, and from people from all across the country, from numbers of networks of activists, state legislators, leaders, community folk. So we welcome all of you and encourage you to send in your questions. And again, Celinda, thanks so much to you. Let me turn it back over to you for fielding these questions that are coming in.
Great. Thank you so much. Our first question is from Tom Ferguson. And Tom asks, does the fact that military spending has more than doubled since 9/11 have no impact? Is this idea really easily rejected?
So say that question again. I'm sorry, what idea is easily rejected?
The idea that military spending has more than doubled since 9/11 and that fact not having any impact.
Oh, yeah. Well, first of all, people think that the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq are explanations for that. I think, and people, it's interesting, in terms of the deficit, the war in Iraq and Afghanistan are, in real people's minds, the number one cause of the deficit. So what ended up being very depressing in all of this was, if we are coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, why didn't people think that we could then cut back on spending? If this is the cause of the deficit, this is the cause of the doubling of the budget, why wouldn't you think once we're out of there that we could cut back? And sadly, people had a very developed frame for understanding this or misunderstanding it. They said, listen, we've worn out a lot of our equipment, et cetera. We may need to replace it. Who knows where the next Afghanistan is going to be? This whole region looks extraordinarily dangerous to people, and they have no idea where or if we're supposed to go into any place or be ready to go into any place. People thought we were spread thin. People still see Korea as dangerous. So, and then of course Iran and Libya and Syria and every place else. So what was most depressing, I think, is that even though people were very clear about the increase in spending that Iraq and Afghanistan has caused, it did not make them think that there would be money left over we could cut.
All right. Thank you, Celinda. Our next question is from Scott Vogel. Scott asks, was there any polling done comparing social spending to Pentagon spending? Saying, for example, for every X number of dollars we spend on the Pentagon, we could hire, 200 teachers or, provide health care or college scholarships.
Yeah, we did a lot of that priorities testing, and it did not test very well. And unfortunately, it tested weaker with women who have been the ones who have bought into that in the past. They have been our priority spenders. And basically their feeling was threefold. One, we cannot hurt our troops and the families. Two, these are jobs in a lot of communities. And three, if we don't keep ourselves safe, then it doesn't matter how many college scholarships we have or elementary school kids we have or whatever. So unfortunately, the priorities piece didn't test very well. In fact, it performed the poorest that we've seen it in quite some time, because that's really been the bread and butter of our messaging to women for so long. And we have seen it declining in its power, and it was one of the reasons we went in, and I really, again, want to commend Juan, because I know resources are very scarce and the leadership of folks in Juan to put together this money and to really look at this and ask the tough questions. But it had been testing weaker, and now we understand why, because we've got women less supportive of these cuts now than men.
All right, our next question is from Ruth Flower. Ruth asks, since people don't believe that we should spend more on the Pentagon budget, do they respond at all to the idea that Pentagon spending will be heading up, and that planned increases should be reined in?
We didn't test it that way. What we tested it as was we tested for another client spending more than the Pentagon asked for, and people thought that was totally absurd. And we tested here the implicit notion of keeping it the same versus, people were really for keeping it the same. Didn't want to cut it, didn't want to increase it. Didn't assume that the changes that, like coming home from Iraq and Afghanistan or reshaping the military, necessarily meant that we could cut the spending.
So our next question is from Laura Bordeaux. Laura asks, can you please speak more about frame of reference and how we can tailor our messages, especially one-on-one?
So tell me what you mean by frame of reference. Meaning framing up the initial messaging?
Right.
So our strongest frame here is, and we have provided, I didn't share it today, but we should send it around, message triangles for you all that I think would be very helpful. But our strongest frames are to talk about that we are going to protect the troops and their families. We're going to keep our families safe, but to do that, we need to reshape the military. We need to look at modern warfare. We need to be cost effective. We need to be smarter. And then to talk about so much of our spending right now is driven by pork barrel politics, lobbyists, campaign contributions, and politics. That's a waste. That's what we should cut out. That should not be what's happening.
All right. Our next question is from Susan Cundiff. Susan asks, regarding drones, do messages on innocents being killed resonate with women?
Not that much, unfortunately. We did not do extensive messaging on drones, and I think attitudes on drones may be evolving somewhat. We just looked at it very briefly in the focus groups when people brought up drones, saying, "Do you worry about the innocents being killed?" But basically, people think that innocents are killed in lots of different kinds of weapons. At least these ones don't have more people being killed and don't have our people being killed. And not particularly is the short answer. But I think this is an area we didn't fully explore, honestly. And our mission for this particular work wasn't to look in depth at drones. So I think that's an area that still needs to be looked at more.
Our next question is from Kim Corsaro. Kim asks, what exactly is the distinction in people's minds between Pentagon spending and military spending?
Oh, really good question. So Pentagon spending invokes bureaucrats. Bureaucrats invoke politics, elected officials, waste, fraud, cronies, contracts. So it gets you into that realm of bureaucrats, political wheeling and dealing, rather than troops, defense, keeping us safe, that kind of thing.
Great. Our next question is from Ariel Dougherty. Ariel asks, how do we get the right framing out to a large audience? Is it more effective to use women-led media?
Oh, I don't know if it's more effective to use women-led media, but I think it's very effective to use women-led media. And I think also to use a lot of the social media that you all are using and the Facebook strategies, etc. So I think passing this on and passing this information framed in the right way, framed in terms of these messages, and remembering that people only have 30 to 45 seconds worth of attention span. But I think that women-led media is very effective. And I think getting this to our elected officials, and that's one of the wonderful things about Juan and Will, so many of our elected officials are supportive. They're ahead of the public in this case, and particularly our women elected officials. But they're not always the most effective in their messaging because of how tricky this area is.
Great. Well, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up. Celinda, thank you again so much for your presentation. It was really, really excellent.
Thank you.
We've had a lot of questions from the audience asking people for the material so they can share with others. So I know it's been very well received, and we appreciate you spending time with us even though you're sick. I just want to remind everyone on the phone lines that we will be sending follow-up materials to you by email this week. We'll be sending out a recording of the webinar, and you'll also get a link to a survey. We welcome your feedback and appreciate hearing your thoughts about this webinar. And just as a heads up, our next webinar is going to take place on January 31st, 2013. And it's going to be at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, and it's going to feature a presentation from CLASP, the Center for Law and Social Policy. Again, thank you so much, everyone, and with that, we're going to end the webinar.